I love Charlie Parker's playing. To me, he really is the Mozart of jazz, and I think phrases like this clearly demonstrate why. But while a phrase like this is mind-blowing, then you can't use it in a solo. It's too long and complicated. It will ruin the flow and sound unnatural, and you don't want your solo to sound like copy-paste blocks from famous artists. I'm gonna show you what a pattern is, why patterns are much more useful than licks, and why you want to turn your licks into patterns. For this to work, you need to be familiar with the basic chords and scales. So for a 2-5-1 in C major, you need to know the arpeggios like this. Basic information like these chord tones is essential. You will see why quite quickly. There's a lot going on in the Parker example, so it's probably better to start with something a little simpler and then we can return to it later. Check out this example from Pat Martino's solo on How Insensitive. This is on a D minor chord, and you have a D minor 7 chord in the 2-5-1 as well. So in this case, I want you to focus on this part of the phrase. So the phrase starts on the 3rd F and then has a 3-note enclosure that takes us to the D, which is of course the root of the chord. Probably makes sense to move it up an octave, so it's a little bit closer to where we were playing the arpeggios. As you'll see, this is really useful, but it's still not a pattern. The reason that you're checking out jazz licks in the first place is probably because your solo lines sound something like this. The reason you sound like this is that you know the scale and the arpeggios, but you're limited in how you make melodies with those tools. The short Pat Martino phrase can actually already improve on that. Check it out. The G7 part of this line of course still needs some work, but that'll come. Notice that I'm using the same phrase on the C major 7. So the bar starts with the 3rd and then is followed by the enclosure taking us to the root. And then I continue just going up the arpeggio. Let's figure out what a pattern is and then turn the Pat Martino phrase into a pattern. Then you'll see how it will help you sound a lot better. I'll first give you an example, but then also give you another way to think about patterns than just short phrases. Right now the Pat Martino phrase is moving from the 3rd of the chord down to the root by adding that enclosure. But you can take the same idea and then use 2 other chord tones. For example, you can start on the 5th of D minor 7. And it also works if you take it from the 7th of that chord. And like this, you can apply it to other chords and you have a much more flexible piece of vocabulary that you can use to create lines that sound great, but doesn't sound like you're a Pat Martino clone. In the next example, I use the pattern on all the chords, but the one on the G7 is a bit cheeky because I'm using it to target the 3rd of C major 7. Like this, it seems like you're just making variations of a phrase, but you can also think of patterns as a way of playing some notes, and that can be incredibly powerful, especially for arpeggios. Let's fix a very common problem. Now, you might not be there yet, but then you will be soon. At some point, you're going to get really tired of your arpeggios always sounding like this. Like this, arpeggios are always the same 8th note run, and it's difficult to make them interesting and fresh. But if you think of an arpeggio as a set of notes that you can play in different patterns, then you could take the C major 7 arpeggio from the previous example and play it with a triplet and a leading note, which is what I usually call the Bebop arpeggio. That sounds like this. But you can also use the 8th note triplet in a different way to get a pattern that can be very useful when you're moving from one chord to the next. You'll see examples of that later. And finally, you have the arpeggio the way that is played in the Charlie Parker example from the beginning of the video, which is what Barry Harris calls a pivot arpeggio. It's a really simple recipe. You play the root, and then you move the rest of the arpeggio down an octave. And that gives you this really beautiful melodic interval skip. And treating these as patterns that you can apply to any arpeggio means that you can now start making lines like this next example, but of course start by working on them one at a time, not all at once if you're new to them. And here you have an example of how that second bebop arpeggio can help you move from D minor 7 to G7. because it's really targeting the third of G. And you can also hear how the pivot arpeggio really breaks up the line in a beautiful way. Now, why is this approach so great? Now, I think it's easy to see that these patterns are much more flexible and easier to use in a solo than the longer licks like the Charlie Parker example from the beginning of the video. But there's actually another advantage that I think is just as important. Here you can see that the Parker example is constructed from 4 short phrases that are put together, and you can use all of those as patterns. One of them is the pivot arpeggio and 2 others are enclosures. Now, if you look at Parker's licks in general, then you will see that they're always constructed from building blocks like these. A short side note on this, I think this clearly shows that enclosures are an essential part of Parker's vocabulary, or in fact, any bop-inspired solo. And I sometimes see people dismissing them as less useful, and that's simply not true. Everybody uses them, they are everywhere. They might be a little bit more difficult to get into your playing, but they are worth it. Just hang in there. Then you get to play lines like this. The other advantage is that you can approach this one variation at a time and not as a huge system of rules or a sea of different options. And when it comes to adding new things to your vocabulary, that is often a much more efficient and practical approach. Let me show you the process I go through if I'm working on getting a pattern from the Charlie Parker lick into my playing. I think this diatonic enclosure is a great option because it's quite simple, but it's also a very strong melody. And then you construct a phrase around that using the things that you already know, that you're already playing. Here I'm leading into it with a scale run and then using the enclosure to get to a B half diminished arpeggio over the G7. But you can also go on to another phrase in the G7, like this pivot arpeggio. For this one, I will leave the first part unchanged. But you want to figure out more ways to lead into it, like this one. And notice that I'm using a G7 line that I actually play quite often. Of course, you only know that if you watched my other videos. The point of this is that you put it together with the things that you're already playing, and in that way, make it a part of your vocabulary, of your playing. Of course, once you have this one, you can take the next pattern that you want to work with or variation of this one that you like. The process gets easier and easier the more that you do it. And I think that vocabulary-based practice is a bit underrated. Let me know what you think. But if you want this to work, then you need to be able to recognize what is going on in the lines. And that means being familiar with some of the common melodic techniques used in jazz. Things like arpeggios, chromaticism, and enclosures. And that is what I cover in this video, which will give you a strong foundation for building more solid lines and get more out of the solos and phrases that you come across. Check it out, learn jazz, make music.